It's occurred to me several times in these last weeks that no one can, in fact, write a book called How to Read and Why. Since I seem to have done so, I suppose I ought to not so much offer an apologia for it, but a kind of brief description of what I think the book attempts to do, and only, of course, by way of sample. I don't think I've actually counted up how many individual short stories, poems, novels, plays are discussed in the course of the work, but I suppose they must be 60-odd or so. They're only a sampler. They have been chosen partly, I suppose, willfully, partly out of intense affection on my own part. Also because I think in their different ways they do illustrate how and why one ought to read. So what I think I will do in the time that I have, I think I will read the very close of the prologue and then take one short story writer, in this case Flannery O'Connor, and read what I've had to say about her. Then look at 3 sonnets by Shakespeare and conclude with an account of the remarkable novel by the late Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. So I begin with the conclusion of the prologue to this book, which is simply called Why Read? I've just quoted Dr. Samuel Johnson, what I think is my favorite passage in his preface to Shakespeare. And this is Johnson. This, therefore, is the praise of Shakespeare, that his drama is the mirror of life, that he who has mazed his imagination in following the phantoms which other writers raise up before him may here be cured of his delirious ecstasies by reading human sentiments in human language, by scenes from which a hermit may estimate the transactions of the world and a confessor predict the progress of the passions. And that ends the quotation from Johnson. To read human sentiments in human language, you must be able to read humanly with all of you. You are more than an ideology, whatever your convictions, and Shakespeare speaks to as much of you as you can bring to him. That is to say, Shakespeare reads you more fully than you can read him, even after you have cleared your mind of cant. No writer before or since Shakespeare has had anything like his control of perspectivism, which outleaps any contextualizations we impose upon the plays. Johnson, admirably perceiving this, urges us to allow Shakespeare to cure us of our delirious ecstasies. Marvelous phrase. Let me extend Johnson by also urging us to recognize the phantoms that the deep reading of Shakespeare will exorcise. One such phantom is the death of the author. Another is the assertion that the self is a fiction. Yet another is the opinion that literary and dramatic characters are so many marks upon a page. A fourth phantom, and I think the most pernicious, is that language does the thinking for us. Still, my love for Johnson and for reading turns me at last away from polemic and toward a celebration of the many solitary readers I keep encountering, whether in the classroom or in messages I receive. We read Shakespeare, Dante, Chaucer, Cervantes, Dickens, Proust, and all their peers because they more than enlarge life. Pragmatically, they have become the blessing, in its true Yahwistic sense, of more life into a time without boundaries. We read deeply for varied reasons, most of them familiar, that we cannot know enough people profoundly enough, that we need to know ourselves better, that we require knowledge not just of self and others, but of the way things are. Yet the strongest, most authentic motive for deep reading of the now much abused traditional canon is the search for a difficult pleasure. There is a reader's sublime, and it seems the only secular transcendence we can ever attain, except for the even more precarious transcendence we call falling in love. I urge you to find what truly comes near to you that can be used for weighing and for considering. Read deeply, not to believe, not to accept, not to contradict, but to learn to share in that one nature that writes and reads. And I'll turn now in the short story section to the part on that remarkable writer, Flannery O'Connor. D.H. Lawrence, a superb writer of short stories, gave the reader a permanent wisdom in one brief remark: trust the tale, not the teller. That seems to me an essential principle in reading the stories of Flannery O'Connor, who may have been the most original tale-teller among Americans since Hemingway. Her sensibility was an extraordinary blend of Southern Gothic and severe Roman Catholicism. So fierce a moralist is O'Connor that readers need to be wary of her tendentiousness. She has too palpable a design upon us to shock us by violence into a need for traditional faith. As teller, O'Connor was very shrewd, yet I think her best tales are far shrewder and enforce no moral except an awakened imagination. O'Connor's South is wildly Protestant, not the Protestantism of Europe, but of the indigenous American religion, whether it calls itself Baptist, Pentecostal, or whatever. The prophets of that religion, and this is a quotation from her, snake handlers, free-thinking Christians, independent prophets, the swindlers, the mad, and sometimes the genuinely inspired, O'Connor named as natural Catholics. Except for this handful of natural Catholics, the people who throng O'Connor's marvelous stories are the damned, a category in which Flannery O'Connor cheerfully included almost all of her readers, including everyone present, I think, here. I think that the best way to read her stories is to begin by acknowledging that one is among her damned, and then go on from there to enjoy her grotesque and unforgettable art of telling. A good man is hard to find remains a splendid introduction to O'Connor. A grandmother, her son and daughter-in-law and their 3 children are on a car journey when they encounter an escaped convict, the misfit, and his 2 subordinate killers. Upon seeing the misfit, the grandmother foolishly declares his identity, thus dooming herself and all her family. The old lady pleads with the misfit, while her family is taken away to be shot. But O'Connor gives us one of her masterpieces in this natural theologian of a killer. Jesus, the misfit declares, thrown everything off balance by raising the dead in a cosmos where there is, as he says, no pleasure but meanness. Dizzy and hallucinating, the terrified grandmother touches the misfit while murmuring, "Why, you're one of my babies, you're one of my own children." He recoils, shoots her 3 times in the chest, and pronounces her epitaph. She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. The tale and the teller came together here, since the misfit clearly speaks for something fierce and funny in O'Connor herself. O'Connor gives us a hypocritical and banal old lady and a killer who is, in O'Connor's extraordinary view, an instrument of Catholic grace. This is meant to be, and certainly is, outrageous because, being damned, we are outraged by it. We would be good, O'Connor thinks, if someone were there to shoot us every minute of our lives. Why do we not resent O'Connor's palpable designs upon us? Her comic genius is certainly part of the answer. Someone who can entertain us so profoundly can damn us pretty much as she chooses. In her Good Country People, another story, we meet the unfortunate Joy Hopewell, who possesses both a PhD in philosophy and a wooden leg, and the fancy first name Holga, which she has given herself. A brash young Bible salesman with the improbably phallic name of Manly Pointer divests Holger of her wooden leg in a haystack, and then he runs off with it. Holga accurately knows herself as of the damned, is she not a philosopher? And we can draw what moral we will from her cruelly hilarious fate. Shall we say of her, she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to seduce her and run off with her wooden leg every minute of her life. O'Connor would have disdained my skepticism, and I am aware that my parody is defensive. But her early stories, though lively, are not her greatest. That comes in such later work as A View of the Woods and Park is Back, and in her second novel, The Violent Bear It Away. A View of the Woods is a sublimely ugly story, featuring the 79-year-old Mr. Fortune and his 9-year-old granddaughter, Mary Fortune Pitts. Both are dreadful, selfish, stubborn, mean, sullen monuments of pride. At the story's end, a nasty fight between the two closes with the grandfather killing the little girl, having throttled her and smashed her head upon a rock. In his excitement and exhaustion, Mr. Fortune has a final view of the woods during a fatal heart attack. This is all grimly impressive, but how should we interpret it? O'Connor remarked that Mary Fortune Pitts was saved and Mr. Fortune damned, but she could not explain why, since they are equally abominable persons, and the death struggle might have gone either way. It is splendid that O'Connor was so outrageous, because our skepticism outraged her and inspired her art. And yet her obsessive spirituality and absolute moral judgments cannot just sustain themselves at the reader's expense. But when I think that, I suddenly recall how dangerously close her literary tastes were to my own. She preferred Faulkner's As I Lay Dying and Nathaniel West's Miss Lonely Hearts to all other works of modern American fiction, and so do I. Reading Flannery O'Connor's stories and The Violent Bear It Away, I am exhilarated to the brink of fear, as I am by Faulkner and West in their grandest works, and by Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which surely O'Connor would have admired had she survived to read it. Turgenev and Chekhov, Maupassant and Hemingway were not ideologues, and the main tradition of the modern short story is certainly theirs and not O'Connor's. And yet her verve and drive, the propulsive gusto of her comic spirit, is overwhelming. Her Catholicism might as well be holy rollerism, so far as the aesthetic effect of her fiction is concerned. There we can locate her natural shrewdness. Her mad and damned American religionists can be parodied, but the parody will not touch her assured Roman Catholicism. More than a comedian of genius, she had also the penetrating insight that religion for her countrymen and women was not the opiate, but rather the poetry of the people. I want to turn now to, in the poetry section, a consideration of 3 sonnets of Shakespeare, chosen not so much as representative of the 154, because I don't think you can, with so extraordinarily varied and baffling a sequence, and I think it is indeed a sequence. Since Shakespeare was, as Borges once said, everyone and no one, we can say of the sonnets that they are, at once, autobiographical and universal, personal and impersonal, ironical and passionate, bisexual and heterosexual, wounded and integral. This is a good place to warn the reader against the increasingly useless literary dogma that the capital letter I speaking a poem is always a mask or persona rather than a human being. The capital letter I of Shakespeare's sonnets is the playwright actor William Shakespeare, creator of Falstaff, Hamlet, Rosalind, Iago, and Cleopatra. When we read the sonnets, we are listening to a dramatic voice, one both like and unlike Hamlet's. The unlikeness is that we are listening to Shakespeare himself, who is, after all, not entirely his own creation. Yet there remains a similarity between Will in the sonnets and Hamlet or Falstaff. Shakespeare ruefully rough-hews his self-presentation, even if he cannot wholly shape it. The meditative voice of the sonnets takes great care to distance itself from its own suffering, sometimes even from its own humiliation. We hear a story in the sonnets that could be called betrayal, and yet we never hear of the death of love, though there is every reason why it ought to die. Of all literature's uncanny effects, to me the uncanniest is Shakespeare's balance in the sonnets between self-alienation and self-affirmation. 'Tis better to be vile than vile esteemed, when not to be receives reproach of being, and the just pleasure lost, which is so deemed not by our feeling, but by others' seeing. For why should others, false, adulterate eyes, give salutation to my sportive blood? Or on my frailties, why are frailer spies, which in their wills count bad what I think good? No, I am that I am, and they that level at my abuses reckon up their own. I may be straight, though they themselves be bevel. By their rank thoughts my deeds must not be shown, unless this general evil they maintain, all men are bad, and in their badness reign. This is Sonnet 121 in a sequence of 154. We do not know whether Shakespeare himself arranged them in their present order, but it seems likely. We are nearing the end of the 126 sonnets addressed to a fair young nobleman, presumably Shakespeare's patron, some think also his lover, the Earl of Southampton. One might want to recommend this sonnet to President William Jefferson Clinton, but will have no occasion to do so. It is the most powerful expression in the language of being condemned for erotic activity by the false, adulterate eyes of others who themselves be bevel, that is to say, crooked. And I wish the poem could have been read aloud frequently on television during our recent national orgy of virtue alarmed, as manifested by talking heads and congressmen. But my concern is how to read it as well as why, so I turn to a closer examination of its magnificently charged diction. By vile, Shakespeare may intend a state of moral baseness, yet the word, as he knew, had in it the notion of being cheap, of low value or price, and so there must be an overtone of social inferiority as well. Part of the complexity of the opening quatrain turns upon which is so deemed. Is the reference to vile or to the just pleasure? Shakespeare deliberately allows this to be ambiguous, and so we must read it both ways. The bitter irony of "'tis better to be vile than vile esteemed, when not to be receives reproach of being," partly means that one may as well be debased in one's behavior, because even if one is actually virtuous, others will see it differently. They will deem one vile, which will end the pleasure one's love ought to give. Yet the other reading is more interesting because even more ironically bitter. Just pleasure can be deemed such by observers, but that will be their judgment and not Shakespeare's, who knows that his love is chaste. Nothing in the remaining 10 lines of Sonnet 121 will resolve this ambiguity. The beholders are mocked for their mockery when they intrusively give salutation to my sport of blood, as if they were cheering Shakespeare on to his supposed sexual performance, which they make into their spectator sport. More advanced in their frailties than those they salute in Shakespeare, they are palpably guilty of ill will, whether they are counting as bad an innocent relationship or moralizing against an actual liaison. Again, Shakespeare does not tell us exactly what he wants us to believe. Instead, he startles us with an extraordinary declaration: "Know I am that I am." Shakespeare, and his readers then and now, could not miss the allusion to Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where Moses requests Yahweh's name, and Yahweh replies, "I am that I am." In the Hebrew, Eya Asher Eya, that is an audacious pun upon Yahweh as a name, and literally means something like, "I will be wherever and whenever I will be." Shakespeare presumably did not know that, and so probably his "know I am that I am" primarily means "I am what I am," but by way of a considerable and deliberate blasphemy. Shakespeare himself did not publish the sonnets, and 121 just may be an independent poem with no necessary reference to any homoerotic relationship with the fair young nobleman. We do not know, and the poem may be stronger for our not knowing. As in his sublimely ranted farewell to comedy, Measure for Measure, Shakespeare neither endorses nor denies the final dark formula, "All men are bad, and in their badness reign." Anger becomes controlled frenzy in the superb Sonnet 129, a lament that only hints at betrayal by the famous and nameless Dark Lady of the Sonnets. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had, past reason hated, as a swallowed bait on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have, extreme. A bliss in proof, and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. The furious energy of this is almost a drum roll, a litany for desire that prophesies only further desire, further erotic disaster. There are no personages in this poem. The fair youth is far off, and even the dark lady is present only by implication. Lust is the hero-villain of this night piece of the spirit. Male lust for the hell that concludes the sonnet, hell being, as is well known, Elizabethan Jacobean slang for the vagina. The ancient commonplace of sadness after coition achieves its apotheosis in Sonnet 129, but at much more than the expense of spirit. So impacted is this sonnet's language that it evades its apparent adherence to the Renaissance belief that every single sexual act shortens a male's life. The reader may hear in Sonnet 129 an intimation of venereal disease in that hell, foreshadowing a Shakespearean preoccupation in many of the plays, Troilus and Cressida and Timon of Athens in particular. That seems the final burden also of the more than ironic Sonnet 144. Two loves I have, of comfort and despair, which like two spirits do suggest me still. The better angel is a man right fair, the worser spirit a woman colored ill. To win me soon to hell, my female evil tempteth my better angel from my side, and would corrupt my saint to be a devil, wooing his purity with her foul pride. And whether that my angel be turned fiend, suspect I may, yet not directly tell. But being both from me, both to each friend, I guess one angel in another's hell. Yet this shall I ne'er know, but live in doubt, till my bad angel fire my good one out. Suggest me still means something like tempt me perpetually. The fair young better angel is clearly not renowned for his purity, and the devil in hell is vernacular for copulation. Guess is laconic, as no guess is involved, while till my bad angel fire my good one out refers less to the end of that affair than to the bestowal of syphilis upon the youth by the dark lady, with an implication that Shakespeare may already have received that gift from her. Why read Sonnet 144? Shakespeare's ironies and lyric genius certainly give the reader more pleasure in scores of the other sonnets, but the subdued yet terrifying pathos of this poem is a unique aesthetic value, troublingly memorable and all but universal in its suggestiveness. The sonnets are a particular element in Shakespeare's awesome achievement. It is appropriate that the central Western writer, inventor of the human, as we continue to know it, should also be the most piercing lyric and meditative poet in the English language. I do not believe that we necessarily come to know the inner or innermost Shakespeare in the sonnets, where he seems to veil himself quite as enigmatically as he does in the plays. Walt Whitman presents us with three metaphors of his own being: myself, my soul, the real me, or me, myself. There are nearly as many metaphors of Shakespeare's being in the sonnets as there are sonnets. Somehow Shakespeare contrives to make all of these images of self persuasive yet tentative. His questioning tribute to the fair young nobleman at the start of Sonnet 53 should better be asked of Shakespeare himself. What is your substance? Whereof are you made, that millions of strange shadows on you tend? And I want to turn finally to the, I think, most extraordinary American novel of recent years, though there have been some extraordinary rivals, the late Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It seems reasonable to judge that the greatest aesthetic achievement of African Americans is the work of the major masters of jazz, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, Bud Powell, and others. But then jazz is the only indigenous American art. African American writers, despite critical confusions among some of their politicized academic cheerleaders, were in no position to found an original literary art. Invisible Man, 1952, by the late Ralph Ellison, remains much the strongest novel by an American black, and its palpable and by Ellison acknowledged debts are to Melville, Mark Twain, Faulkner, Dostoevsky, and to the poetic language of T.S. Eliot. Toni Morrison, though she passionately argues otherwise, is also a child of Faulkner, as well as of Virginia Woolf. Ellison was a writer of immense and mordant sensibility, and his pride at having composed Invisible Man was the largest single factor in his refusal to publish a second novel during his lifetime. I urge the reader towards Invisible Man and not to Juneteenth, edited from Ellison's manuscripts. I do not believe he would have sanctioned its publication. More than once he had asked me if any American novelist, except for Henry James, had really composed a second masterwork. Presumably he was thinking of Melville, Twain, Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, among others, and I would have been tactless to suggest candidates, and so did not. Yet he was well aware of Faulkner, who in his grand early phase had created The Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, Light in August, and Absalom, Absalom. Faulkner, a Southern white, faced many cultural pressures, but nothing like those that bothered Ellison in the last quarter century of his life. Feminist critics, Marxists, and African-American nationalists complained of Ellison's insistence at setting art above ideology. Refusing all polemic, the novelist partly withdrew into his massive dignity. There are essays galore, he commented upon some of them to me with ironical dismissal, that chide Ellison and his narrator protagonist Invisible Man for not embracing the true political faith. Though Ellison, as the reader will see for herself, ends with an ambiguity tinged with hope, the typical condemnation is that Invisible Man will never come up from underground because he lacks the black mother, black muse, or Marxist wiliness that could propel him back to society. Ellison wrote his own novel, and we do best to learn how to read it and why. Another age will come with other cultural politics, while Invisible Man will retain the American and universal imaginative vitality with which Ralph Waldo Ellison, to give him his full actual name, endowed it. He was quite proud of that being his full name. At Invisible Man's conclusion, the narrator again invokes Louis Armstrong, who throughout has been his chosen precursor, indeed his spiritual guide, Virgil to his Dante. And I quote from this, "And there's still a conflict within me. With Louis Armstrong, one half of me says, open the window and let the foul air out, while the other says it was good, green corn before the harvest." In the prologue, Invisible Man listens to Armstrong playing and singing, "What did I do to be so black and blue?" And he reflects, perhaps I like Louis Armstrong because he's made poetry of being invisible. Ellison, a deep student of Armstrong's work, understood that jazz changed from a music of the folk to a high art of innovation because of Armstrong. In some sense, Ellison himself transformed Charles Chestnut and Richard Wright, rather as Armstrong transcended his precursors in jazz, a movement from folklore to what we now call high modernism. Invisible Man is a historical novel because most of it takes place in the 1920s and 1930s, when the United States was hardly less racist a society than it had been in the 1870s and 1880s. Though we need not congratulate ourselves that much of what goes on in Ellison's novel could not happen now, it can and does, public attitudes have altered to some degree, and the law, at least, is different. The book's brotherhood, the Communist Party, scarcely exists, and the remarkable Ras the Exhorter has been replaced by the more mundane Reverend Al Sharpton. The even more remarkable Reinhardt, Reverend and Drug Runner, has a host of contemporary equivalents, but here nature short of Ellison's art, and the exuberant Reinhardt remains larger than life. Invisible Man, Melvillian and Faulknerian, like Nathaniel West Smith's Lonely Hearts, Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, and Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, shares the negative sublimity of all the novels I have been reading in this chapter, and shares also in their greatness. Kenneth Burke, to me the most admirable of 20th century American critics, several times in conversation urged me to meditate upon Ellison as the American master of the novel of education, the genre of the German Bildungsroman, of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain and Goethe's Wilhelm Meister. Mann's novel is a lovingly ironic parody of the genre, but Ellison seems to me a demonic or tragic parody. His Invisible Man, in some respects, is closer to Dostoevsky's Underground Man than to a developmental hero of the Goethean, Mannian sort. Ellison himself cited Malraux, T.S. Eliot, Hemingway, Faulkner, and Dostoevsky as his most direct literary ancestors. Interestingly, he excluded Moby Dick, which lends Invisible Man its crucial Jonah component. I suspect that Melville, like Faulkner, was a touch too close, while Dostoevsky was safely distant in place and in time. The hero of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground suffers humiliations and narrates his subsequent rejection of the world, withdrawing to a hovel. This symbolic withdrawal is to some extent a rejection of Western values and ideas, though the underground man is well aware that European rationalism has an inescapable place in his own consciousness. But he rebels against it, profoundly believing that it violates his integrity. Ellison's Invisible Man is considerably more gifted than Dostoevsky's angry protagonist, and as an African American, he has a much more complex predicament. Dostoevsky wanted to reject Europe. Ellison passionately refused to give up on America, though his Invisible Man would not accept it upon its hypocritical terms. Moby Dick is haunted by the Book of Jonah, and so is Invisible Man. I don't know whether Melville knew that the Book of Jonah is read aloud to the congregation on the Jewish Day of Atonement, but Ellison certainly did. The Book of Jonah is not apocalyptic, but survivalist. Jonah, the evasive prophet, is resurrected from the belly of the whale after he has repented, fleeing from Yahweh out of mere pique. Humor clearly dominates the Hebrew text, since Jonah's vexation against Yahweh is that the prophecy proved successful and the people of Nineveh turned away from evil, thus averting the city's destruction. The Invisible Man, like Jonah, is always in repression, to which Freud assigned always the metaphor of fleeing. False fathers, Bledsoe, Lucas Brockway, Jack of the Brotherhood, continually betray the Invisible Man, even as Jonah feels betrayed by God the Father, who declined to obliterate Nineveh. Chased by whites into a manhole, Invisible Man becomes Jonah in the whale's belly, thus beginning his underground existence from which, as I read it, he is finally about to emerge as the novel concludes. The book's prologue, with its lyrical power, sweeps the reader downwards to a Dantesque vision as Invisible Man, listening to Louis Armstrong play and sing, "What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue?" descends the levels of an African-American inferno. In his phantasmagoria, he hears a preacher taking as text the blackness of blackness, which touches its depth in the Jonah motif of the whale's belly with a great shout, "It'll put you, glory, glory, O my Lord, in the whale's belly." Covertly, Ellison alludes to Father Mapple's great sermon on Jonah in Moby Dick, where each of us is adjured to be a patriot only to heaven. And yet Ellison enforces the African-American difference. Blackness puts you in the whale's belly, and blackness alone is insufficient to resurrect you, though nothing American society offers is going to resurrect you either. Self-reliance, even if you're actually named for Emerson, will not send you out of the whale's belly, and yet it can change the nature of your sojourn. Invisible Man is as intricate and rich in texture as Moby Dick and Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, and the reader is best advised to take the book slowly and steadily, reading aloud to herself and others whenever the prose is richest. The rewards are immense. This is a novel that transcends politics and ideology, while never for a moment evading the Invisible Man's obligation to prophesy the destruction of the new Nineveh, the United States of America, unless it turns now away from the hatefulness of the final consequences of African-American slavery. Since his symbolic function is so dominant, the reader may slight the Invisible Man's personality and character, which would be a great loss. Ellison, probably with an eye upon James Joyce's Ulysses, magnificently fuses naturalism and symbolism in his novel. Though necessarily nameless, Invisible Man's personality renders any name redundant. We hear his voice incessantly, ironic, eloquent, jazz-influenced, sometimes furious with outrage, yet always open to a vision that others yet might match his own humane sensibility. Perhaps he is the black Ulysses, on the implicit model of Joyce's Poldy, who abhors all violence and hatred. Far more of an outsider even than Poldy in Dublin, the Invisible Man to survive answers violence with violence and hatred with fierce irony. A surrogate for Ellison himself, invisible man's cultural aesthetic is jazz. Ellison, with profound insight into jazz, defined it as a perpetual contest, as he put it, a cutting, in which each innovator transcends his forerunners while ironically incorporating them. That is the secret of the invisible man's language and is the basis of the continuous stylistic splendor of Ellison's novel. Its narrative techniques and evolving styles have set a standard for what should be called novelistic jazz that no one else has been able to attain. The fusion of a jazz aesthetic with an essentially Faulknerian style made Invisible Man a book that remains unique, though the earlier Toni Morrison has come closest to Ellison's synthesis. There's a subtle polyphony that goes on throughout Invisible Man. The narrative line is clear, but something else frequently plays against it, as in the great epiphany of Reinhardt. Holy man, pimp, drug racketeer, who appears in a cardinal's robe in front of his congregation under the gold rubric, "Let there be light." Backing away from Reinhardt's apotheosis, the invisible man who has weathered nearly anything you can imagine is shocked into the realization that Reinhardt and the truth are one. And I will quote a remarkable paragraph and make a final comment and be done. This is Ellison at his finest. It was too much for me. I removed my glasses and tucked the white hat carefully beneath my arm and walked away. Can it be, I thought, can it actually be? And I knew that it was. I had heard of it before, but I'd never come close. Still, could he be all of them? Rhine the runner, and Rhine the gambler, and Rhine the briber, and Rhine the lover, and Reinhardt the reverend? Could he himself be both rind and heart? What is real anyway? But how could I doubt it? He was a broad man, a man of parts who got around. Reinhardt the rounder. It was true as I was true. His world was possibility, and he knew it. He was years ahead of me, and I was a fool. I must have been crazy and blind. The world in which we lived was without boundaries, a vast, seething, hot world of fluidity, and Ryan the rascal was at home. Perhaps only Ryan the rascal was at home in it. It was unbelievable, but perhaps only the unbelievable could be believed. Perhaps the truth was always a lie. This is a paradigm for Ellison's achievement of an intricate verbal jazz. Playing just off the beat are the variations on a refrain. Could he himself be both Rind and Hart, and Reinhardt the rounder, and Rhine the rascal, triumphantly repeated? Ras the exhorter, vividly and sympathetically portrayed by Ellison, is not a temptation for the invisible man, but the metamorphic Reinhardt heartbreakingly and hilariously is. Though Ellison's picaresque hero finally identifies Reinhardt's freedom with chaos rather than imagination, again we must trust the tale and not the teller. Ras the destroyer is a figure of sinister pathos, but still we are moved because in the background we can hear the jazz of Ras the exhorter. What do we hear in Reinhardt's great music? It would be difficult to disengage Reinhardt from the context in which jazz originated. One might go further and mention Reinhardt's literary comrades, Villon, Marlowe, Rimbaud, major poets who were in fact cutthroats, thieves, spies, runners. The invisible man accepts Reinhardt as context, but not as forerunner. There he chooses Louis Armstrong, who broke through context. Ellison, not quite willing to assert as much for himself, famously ends the novel by implicating the reader in the imagination of invisibility, crying out, "Who knows but that on the lower frequencies I speak for you." Thank you. Good.